It could have come from the shell-shocked faces in the trenches. It might have been the Flanders mud that no man who served here could forget. It might have been the dead, 3,600 at Vimy alone. But in the end, the inspiration came to the monument sculptor during the night, in a dream.
And it's this wonderful dream where he dreams that he sees the ghosts of the Canadians in the landscape. And how they rise from the dead, and they come to the aid of their living compatriots. And that dream, it speaks to so many things. It speaks to an anxiety that people who lived through the war have felt, an anxiety to not to forget the great sacrifice that their young men had made. And it also spoke to the sadness.
Jacqueline Hucker was an historical advisor during the restoration.
It is, I think, one of the great monuments of the First World War. And the First World War was to end all wars at that time. It is, we have to remember what war was about, the suffering. We have to learn from it. And we have one of the enduring monuments of the First World War. It's also a great work of art.
The artist, the dreamer, was Walter Allward, a Canadian sculptor who won the contest held to pick a design, and then spent 14 years in France, carving the giant sculptures and supervising the tiniest details of the massive project. Architects and historians speak of its surprisingly modern lines and the builder's fanatical attention to detail.
The Vimy Monument is seen as Walter Allward's crowning achievement, his legacy, his masterpiece, and he was driven. He spent years putting off requests from the Canadian government to speed up the process, searching for the perfect stone. He traveled all over Europe, North America, eventually found this stone in Croatia, just at the time when everyone's patience had pretty well run out. And that was just the beginning. But it indicated how important it was for him for everything to be exactly right.
The last stone in place, 6,000 Canadians assembled on the ridge in 1936, World War I veterans and their families, and as today, high school students. On this sacred ground, on land ceded to Canada by France in perpetuity, King Edward VIII unveiled the monument.
It is one of the consolations which time brings that deeds of valor done on those battlefields long survive the quarrels which drove the opposing hosts to conflict. Vimy will be one such name.
The giant spires, though, rise not just to the Canadians killed at Vimy, but throughout the Great War. The 11,000 carefully carved names belong to those who died in France and whose graves are not known.
He speaks of the nobility of their sacrifice, which today that sounds hokey. We're not quite there anymore. We're very modern. But this is the first time the ordinary soldier had been honored in death. Only in the First World War do we get that. And this is what he does, and he makes them genuine heroes, and they were, and they'd never been remembered like this, and that he did all that, and people can understand it, and they can still feel that when they come here.
It's an enormous monument, so you come at it, and what you're confronted with is the tomb, the empty tomb, and above it, the grieving figure of Mother Canada. And that is certainly about loss. And on each side you have the breaking of the sword and the compassion. And you look above that and you have the statue of sacrifice. And above that, the passing of the torch, and then your eyes go up the pylons, and at the top you get faith, you get love, you get hope, and eventually at the very top of the two pylons you get justice on the one side and peace on the other. I think he succeeded in doing what he set out to do, which was to deal with sacrifice and try to wrest from that sacrifice something that would lead to hope and not to despair.
They called it the war to end all wars, but Allward feared the ridge would be fought over once again. Sure enough, in 1940, newspapers reported that the Nazis had bombed it on their way to Paris. Canada was outraged, and in response, Hitler made the memorial the first stop on his own journey to the French capital to prove the bombing reports false. Hitler apparently admired the monument, and when the Allies retook Vimy, they saw for themselves that the Nazis had left it alone. Having survived the Second World War, the monument now faced a new enemy, time. These clean lines fulfilled Allward's vision, but they left the monument open to the elements. And by the end of the last century, these sacred stones here on Hill 145 were crumbling.
The surprising thing when we first approached the monument is that from the distance it looked in quite reasonable shape. The form was there, the silhouette was as we expected it. It was only as you approached you began to realize that there were dark streaks across the surface, there were cracked and broken stones, and then you would walk right up to it and find chunks of the monument all around the base, so that the elegance and the beauty of Allward's monuments sort of disappeared the closer you got to it. And that was very depressing in a way, because you could understand his vision from the distance and yet you couldn't get close to it.
The names of Canadians who had died in France, and we don't know where their graves are, half of them were fading or had disappeared. To be honest with you, I sort of felt ashamed for being Canadian.
In 2001, the Canadian government decided to restore the monument, and by 2004, Vimy Ridge was again alive with the sound of chisels and saws. As it had done in the 1920s, the government set up a panel to oversee the work. It included architects, historians, and former generals.
We weren't looking for some sort of cheapo job that, you know, we've got this thing over there, it's far away anyways, and we'll throw a couple dollars at it and we'll fix it up. It had to be as serene as possible with the original piece of work.
In the end, it cost $20 million to dismantle and rebuild the monument stone by stone. Many had to be replaced with new ones cut from the same area in Croatia.
But Vimy is so perfect. It's like the Parthenon. Every line is absolutely flat, straight. The curves are all beautifully symmetrical. So in rebuilding it, there was no room for error. You couldn't be a few millimeters off on each stone, or it just wouldn't have added up.
It took 3 years, but the towers on the ridge are once again shining white.
It was an act of remembrance. It was trying to actively remember what it all meant. And so much care that went into restoring the names and restoring the monuments. And I think it looks fabulous, and this is the way it should look.
My first experience there as a young officer was an experience of sort of feeling the vibrations of those who died on that battlefield. Then you sense the enormity of what happened there, but also the enormity of our country, the power that our country has, the potential that we have, and how we can inspire our youth to go well beyond themselves.
Allward was really creating this monument not to glorify himself, not to do something specific for the visitor, but to honor the people who had died on that hillside and whose blood still runs in that chalk.
It speaks to the sadness of the living, those people who had lost sons and fathers and brothers and lovers. And it's amazing because monuments are for the living.